Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Zero Books and Repeater Media. I'm Craig from the Acid Horizon podcast. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Enrico Monacelli, author of The Great Psychic Outdoors, Lo-Fi Music, and Escaping Capitalism. Out now on Repeater Books. The question: how has the aesthetics of an impoverished sound image and the DIY ethos familiar to what we would call lo-fi music, how has it been able to conjure portals between the capitalist hellscape and the lingering horizon of a future beyond capitalism itself? Who are and have been artists that are and have been the harbingers of hope, heralding the new through the homegrown hiss and warble of a shambling Porta Studio 4-track? Enrico joins us today to talk about his new book, both a genealogy of and a journey into the legacy of degraded sound. And Enrico, thank you for coming on the channel today.
Thank you very much. Longtime fan, first-time caller. So
all right.
I'm very honored to be here.
Feels good to hear that. So let's talk lo-fi. I've been doing these kinds of interviews for about 3 years now, and it's not uncommon to come upon the claim, like the one that you're making right now, that a particular genre or a style of music affords us a chance to either forge a new community or create this kind of rupture in the current cultural fabric that allows us to discover new intensities, or these things can become a catalyst for something revolutionary. And as a fan of certain lo-fi recordings myself, I maintain a peculiar bias in favor of this conjecture. But perhaps you can begin by talking about what has allowed you to think about lo-fi music in conjunction with this idea of escaping capitalism, and what was then the impetus to write this book?
Sure. Well, it's certainly the first question that came to me when I decided to write a book on lo-fi. I kind of asked myself, what is so radical about lo-fi? What makes it a viable option for all of those who desire a world beyond capitalism, beyond the one we've got? And the answer came to me when I started thinking about lo-fi outside of the boundaries of the genre and the calcified idea of what lo-fi actually is. When I started looking at lo-fi as a practice, it became kind of an obsession of mine, because lo-fi presented itself as the most cyberpunk sort of ethos that we've got to confront the way we produce music. One of the things that I think it's quite important to understand and to get into my book is the idea to sort of go beyond the idea that lo-fi is a naive genre, or a genre made of simpler, more authentic tunes and recorded in simpler ways. I actually believe that lo-fi is the only genre we've got that is so obsessed with the music production and the ways in which we produce the sounds that it sort of gives us a critical perspective on the whole studio industrial complex. It is a genre that is obsessed with the way we make music, and therefore it's the best way to sort of approach how music is made under capitalism. It's the most critical music you can have, at least in my opinion. And that's sort of the thing that made it stood out to me, the thing that made me say, okay, this is worth writing about, because it is a genre that it's able to conjure this sort of like escape from the normal conditions under which a pop song is made, by hacking the mainframe, in a sense, going straight to the wires and the way that a song is made, like directly. So yeah, if I had to sort of give an abridged version of what I think is so radical about lo-fi, what sort of intensities it conjures, I'd say precisely this: it is the most cyberpunk genre. It is a genre against the way we produce music. It's a practical critique.
Interesting. You know, take a sip of beer or have a shot every time I say Boards of Canada during this particular podcast. But it recalls, for me, it makes me think about something Boards of Canada said once in an interview, or at least a practice that they had, or a proclivity that they had, which was to take something that had a stereo image and collapse it into mono. And there's something that's kind of interesting and even transgressive about it, in the sense, we live in the time where there's now this competition for loudness, a competition for, the stereo field complexity. Like, I think of the whole wall of sound phenomenon and how that's evolved over decades now. What for you, or what is it at the level of sense and affect that you believe happens when one either consumes or produces lo-fi art? And how do you think this brings to bear upon a political sensibility antagonistic to the kinds of lives that are produced under capitalism?
I like that you quoted Boards of Canada right away, because I think it sort of give me an out to answer your question. Because what really strikes me in their music is sort of the physicality, in a sense, of sound. You have this, it's not just, the very banal idea that it's more rustic as opposed to, I don't know, Affix Twin or Onetrix Point Never. But the thing that really strikes me is this strife to bring forth the very actual matter of the sound itself. You can hear the recording process. So the thing that I find like most interesting in the way sort of lo-fi feels, both as a listener and as a musician, is precisely this sort of kinship with the machine, with the physicality of the music production. Again, what in one of the chapbook, I talk about R. Stevie Moore, that was one of the sort of great outsider of American indie music. And I think that the thing that it's most interesting about him is the way in which he was able to sort of record the entirety of his existence, releasing like 400 records or something like that. And the most interesting thing of them all, it's how in each and every record you can sort of hear the room. You can hear the mechanism, in a sense, that is going on behind the song. And one of the points that I make in that chapter is this idea that R. Stevie Moore was able to speak his mind, to be absolutely sincere and personal, precisely because of this kinship with the machine. So I think that there's basically an effective continuity between this kinship with the microphones or whatever, and the possibility of exploring new forms of expressions. Because, of course, if you sort of jailbreak the methods of producing a pop song, you can sort of reclaim the contents of your life that are normally excluded from, a mainstream charting song. So there's this capacity in taking back the sound of conjuring this other selves, in a sense, this capacity of reclaiming the expressive potentialities of these same machineries. So I think that at the end of the day, the answer cannot be univocal. It cannot be, the sensibility or the affects of lo-fi music or this or that, because there are a multitude of ways one can repurpose the sonic production of a pop song. But at the same time, the baseline remains always the same. Once you sabotage the way things are supposed to go about, you can discover new sensibilities and new ways of sort of approaching the production of not only music, but of a self through music. So I believe that's probably, but that's probably also a very personal question, because I think at the end of the day, it's also my own personal way of approaching lo-fi, but it's something that I wouldn't want to take out of the equation, because it's still this sort of critical potentiality that it had in me and that I would like to reproduce and see if other feels the same way. When I was presenting the book here in Milan, I had the chance of talking with Giacomo Stefanini of the hardcore punk band Cobra, which comes from a totally different milieu. But what surprised me is, even if they're dealing with very different forms of the expression from the one I talk about in the book, there was this sort of baseline of sort of understanding one another when we say that repurposing the machine gives you an out to become something other, something completely different. So yeah, I think it's a very personal sort of one-to-one experience with lo-fi music, but it's also something that I think it's worth communizing and seeing where it goes.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about the idea of the personal versus the individual. This is something that really came up for me when I read your book. But just to offer a personal anecdote, I started producing music almost 25 years ago. And one of the first platforms that I used was a DAW, desktop audio workspace, called Sony Acid 3.0. I don't know if anybody who's listening remembers this. This is one of the early ones, like around the era of Fruity Loops or something like that.
Sure.
And I mean, I think that the name acid is ironic against what we're talking about here today. But what I thought was interesting was, I mean, those are digital platforms in a way that digital music kind of democratized production. It put it in more consumers' homes. But what has been interesting about my own personal lineage in producing music is I kind of gravitated towards lo-fi, ultimately getting into hardware, and very recently actually acquiring a somewhat sought after, not very expensive, but maybe expensive for what it is, a Library of Congress C1 tape player, which has this very unique sort of lo-fi warble quality that a lot of electronic musicians like Boards of Canada would be very much into. And I think you're right to say that, you know, the physicality of the machine itself, and also the inherent limitations of the machine. It's almost like we're encountering the real in some sense. Like even the play and eject button on that have very different and distinct feels on it. Not to mention the sound that it produces is, in some sense quite limited and very difficult to control. And there's a way in which that you, as the user of the machine, need to be sensitive to its capacities and its limitations. And I think this is one of the profound things about lo-fi music, is really understanding the lo-fi machine as a kind of body without organs, as Gary might say. But I think, we can talk more about that later, but I'm curious about this idea of escaping capitalism. What is it about lo-fi music, the image, the sound image of lo-fi music itself, that affords us this escape?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the sort of theory backdrop of this idea is mainly to be found in Paolo Virno's work. Virno was an autonomist and sort of an heretical Marxist, let's put it this way. And at some point during his elaboration of his theories, he started to claim that a social revolution, even on an enormous scale, could only be imagined as a sort of exodus, as people taking their lives and almost literally going elsewhere. Maybe not physically, not literally moving, but sort of deserting their previous existence. And an example which I found extremely, extremely fitting for my analysis of lo-fi music was his idea that a social exodus, like this sort of revolution as escape, can only begin if and only if we started to repurpose our labor force in different ways. What he says in his work is that a lot of the most vibrant contribution that, the student movement or the feminist movement gave to critical theory was the idea of taking our lives back through doing labor differently, in a very sort of qualitative sense. Like, take the machines and stop working for your boss or for whatever. Start working for your community, sort of a big sort of collective sabotage. And I think that escape is the only word at cut it when it comes to this sort of theory, because it is not just sort of taking power from the state, but is a sort of impetus to start living in a completely different way. It's this like psychedelic vision of repurposing one's life from the ground up, which can only be imagined really by sort of fleeing your previous existence, by sort of leaving behind this carcass of your old habits and the way you used to run your life. And I think that sadly, escape as a concept in broader sort of theory circles has sort of a bad rap, because most of the time it is associated with like escapism or not wanting to confront the, I don't know, class struggles or important issues like that. But I don't think that that's the case at all. On the contrary, it is sort of bringing the social clashes to its like ultimate conclusion and seeing there's no reconciling with the way the world runs right now. There's only like carving difficultly and painfully a way out of it. And I know I've sort of like, I'm talking with an expert of escape and escape theory. So I'm sort of like going on this tangent because I know I have a crowd that will not sort of push back against it. But I'm also like, I'm very fascinated. There's a book that just came out here in Italy by Franco Bifo Berardi that it's called Desert, like as like deserting an army and things like that. And I'm very like happy to see like this idea of like desertion as a radical way of engaging with capital, gaining momentum, because it is like probably one of the strongest, like after the whole accelerationism thing in the 2010s, and the interest for like escape and exit, but which was still very much framed in this logic of the only way out is through. It is refreshing to see now the idea of escape being sort of mouthed by Marxist critics, or at least coming from an heretical and Deleuzian lineage of Marxism. So yeah, I think that there's no contradiction between like wanting to escape and wanting to overthrow capitalism. It is the same practice in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm completely with you. I was actually very fond of Virno's writings in graduate school. And in fact, I would credit my reading of Virno as being part of this turn towards this notion of escape. I mean, just a little sneak preview of our book, Anti-Oculus, a philosophy. One of the ways that we rethink not just Deleuze and Guattari, but Deleuze's early work, even as early as Difference and Repetition, as the impetus for any sort of revolutionary or insurrectionary action begins with this notion of refusal, the refusal of an image of thought. And I think the very basis of dehabituation, desubjectivation, the creation of the kind of plane of consistency that's going to create the kinds of communities that will bring about the new requires this incipient refusal of the world as it is. And so, yes, I am with you on the fact that escapism merely isn't an act of cowardice. In fact, it's probably the preeminent act of courage in some ways, because we need to have that moral courage to overcome all of those intensities, all of those impetuses that bring us back into the system. And I mean, we assert that the sort of fundamental act or gesture that one must make before undertaking like even a utopian project requires this refusal, which then brings us, of course, to Deleuze and Guattari, who Guattari is one of the first and important mediators in your theory of lo-fi. And I was very happy to see it at the beginning of the book, because not only do we see Guattari as this sort of harbinger of molecular revolutions, but you associate him as a figure associated with real lo-fi insurrections during years of lead. right? And you reflect upon his teenage son's affinity for DIY radio, which in the eyes of Guattari himself, Felix Guattari, that is, that constituted a real politics of resistance. Also, and it also evidenced the, which we could also see in the proliferation of free radio in Italy during that time. Could you perhaps offer us a vignette of that moment in history and why Italy's autonomous movement stands out to you as an important note in your theory of lo-fi?
Yeah, absolutely. When I sort of encountered that bit of course, being like Italian and born and raised here, I was always vaguely aware of the history of insurrections and critical thinking in my country. But I never thought I would go there with my book on lo-fi because, of course, it seems very distant in a sense. But I was looking for sort of a way to narrativize the concepts that I was bringing forth in my book. And out of desperation, I was reading Guattari because it was also part of my PhD. So it was part of a wider reading that I was doing at the time. And at one point, I stumbled on this interview, which is amazing because it's basically my book condensed in a few pages. And at the end of the interview, he basically says, well, my son, he's not into politics. He doesn't like the state, but he's not like into critiquing and doing like this formal political gestures that are often associated with political engagement overall. What he does though is building free radios with his soldering iron. So what he says is, through this act of taking the airways by storm with this minuscule project of his, he's doing politics by other means. He's taking the power out of the hands of the state and back to the listeners and the people that will collaborate with him. So this gestures which might seem small in comparison to like big utopian projects are actually for Guattari this sort of the beginning of this anti-political, he says, movement outside the grasp of the state. So what he's saying is basically, again, my big lo-fi argument that taking back the machines has like this capability of making you other. So, and from there, I was like, okay, it's a very fun example. I can use it in the book. But then I started looking into whether Guattari has wrote anything other on like free radios and things like this. And of course he did, because he was enmeshed with this movement that took Europe, but especially Italy, by storm at the time of free radios. The example that I make in the book is Radio Alice, which is possibly the most famous one, also because the aforementioned Franco Bifo Berardi was involved in Radio Alice and he often spoke about it. But it was also the one that had the biggest impact on the Italian unconscious, so to speak, the Italian political unconscious, because Radio Alice had this very aggressive, militant image. It was broadcast through this equipment, which was stolen apparently from like World War II remnants. It was like a military radio that was broadcasting through Bologna, and the studio was open to the public. So it was like the street continuing inside the studio itself. It was like this big sort of movement on its own, this like molecular insurrection happening in one room. And it was violently shut down at some point. And its shutdown itself is quite fascinating because it stood as a document of sort of the end of that period of political uproar, because it was recorded and broadcast throughout. So we can still hear the moment it was shut down, which again I think it's a testament how correct Gattari was in his assessment of free radios and in general the idea of broadcasting through other means. Because I think that what is most fascinating about Radio Alice is the fact that it was also able to broadcast what is usually outside the scope of what can be shown to the public, what can be heard. So it is, in fact, a sort of a testament of the strength of doing it yourself in a very basic sense, because it gave them the possibility to broadcast the unbroadcastable, the ultimate sort of document witnessing the violence of the state against what was basically an innocent art project. And another thing that I think that it's quite interesting is that this Radio Alice experiment perfectly ties back to our current interest in the 60s and more generally in psychedelic culture, because they were doused in this like very ironic and prankster-esque sort of psychedelia. They started their broadcasting by playing Jefferson Airplane, and their name, of course, is from like White Rabbit. So this idea of rabbit going through the other side. And I think it is fascinating because in a sense it sort of anticipated our current interest in psychedelic modes of thinking, in these sort of the whole acid communist project. They were sort of living and dying by it, because their idea was this production of a completely new utopic space outside the grasp of capital and the state. So yeah, since my book was basically an offshoot of the Acid Communist Fragment by Mark Fisher, this whole thing sort of tied together by itself, giving me everything I needed through Gattari and through Radio Alice, and it sort of launched the book through its like obvious conclusion in a sense. But it's still interesting because at the end of the day, Radio Alice was a lo-fi project. It was lo-fi the way it was broadcasted and recorded. Therefore, even if it is like a hyper-political example of lo-fi music, something that most lo-fi music isn't, it is still sort of giving an historical antecedent to my own argument, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's profound thinking about Radio Alice. And actually, for me, hearing that for the first time from an Italian person's mouth, me being the crass Anglophone, Radio Alice is the way that I read it. I mean, it's just incredible to think that was in a subversive activity, against today's world of podcast milieu. Can you imagine like 6 black Chevy Suburbans pulling up and yanking me out of the chair right now for having this conversation? No. It seems that was a much different world. But actually, before 12 people in the YouTube comments asked you for the name of the essay or the name of the interview where Gattari talks about his son, where can we find that, and what are some of the other resources that
the interview is from Molecular Revolution, I think.
Molecular Revolutions, okay.
I think,
right?
No, wait, let me check, because
okay. Yeah, all right.
It may not be the case.
Yeah, I know there's actually various versions of the book too.
No, it's from Soft Subversions.
As I mentioned earlier, the word that comes up for me when reading this book, I mean, I see it in the introduction, and when you talk about Daniel Johnston in particular, is this word personal, which there's a way that I understand the definition of the word personal, or at least a connotation of the word personal, as being distinct from the concept of individual. And perhaps the importance of the personal dimension of our collective experience of music is not exclusive to any particular genre of music, but through your lens, the lo-fi lens, lo-fi seems to embody this ethos, which is distinctly personal in some ways, given the nature of the encounter with lo-fi recordings, either as a consumer or producer. I mean, just think of the bedroom producer, for example, making their record on the Porta Studio 424 or something like that. And this might be evidence, as I said, in the life of somebody like Daniel Johnston, whose artistic success is largely attributable to the work that he did out of his own home. And it's arguable too that once he, was cast into the limelight, we didn't see a reproduction of the quality of his music. Do you think that's an adequate characterization of how we imagine lo-fi music? Like, what do you think is the connection between the personal dimension or the sort of private dimension of the experience with the collective experience of escaping capitalism?
Well, this is an extremely interesting question, because there's this arrogance when you write a book where you believe you're sort of the master and you control everything there is in the book. But you're right that the personal dimension is very much central to the book, even though I didn't want it to be, in a sense, because as I was sort of ditching the whole idea that lo-fi is a naive or more authentic or rustic genre, I was also ditching the idea that lo-fi was sort of this like weirdo music for very private people. But it isn't. But I think that there's something to that dimension, something to that sort of stereotype that reflected back also on the kind of book I wanted to write, and in the perspective I wrote the book from. Because jokingly, when I was talking about the book as I was writing it, and as soon as it came out, I was saying that my book is not really theory and it's not really music journalism, it's more fan theory. Because I honestly believe that the book, one of the biggest appeal, I don't know how to call it, one of the strongest point, I think, of the book is that it is written from a fan perspective. It is driven mostly by passion, and theory sort of follows and tries to give a form to the sort of unrequited love I have for lo-fi music and lo-fi culture and the community around it. So there's definitely this sort of like very personal take on lo-fi, and it reflects also on this obsession over the inwardness of these characters, this sort of like very affect heavy musicians that were very much in tune with this sort of personal space they were carving out for themselves, this sort of utopian little island they were building to make their music function. But one thing that I would certainly criticize in the idea of the personal is, well, not criticize, but I would like to sort of move it way far away from the sort of idea that it means to be individual or individualized, in a sense. Because one of the reasons why I chose to write a book from a fan perspective is that I believe that the fan perspective is probably one of the most collective and unselfish position one can have under like consumer capitalism, because the fan is almost by definition part of a crowd, part of like this mass of people enjoying something together. And it felt like that for me, that every time I was, I don't know, workshopping a chapter, I was always doing that with people I knew were into lo-fi with this very like fan passion. So one of the reasons why, for example, at one moment there was, I was debating which should be like the very first author I would be talking about. And my biggest fear was letting down this like bunch of like people that were telling me, no, you have to start from Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney is the first lo-fi musician. So this sort of like back and forth with other fans was sort of the drive that made me build the book. But yeah, the important bit is that fandom is a personal perspective in so much as personal is part of a wider collective, this sort of trans individual position where you're part of this sort of affects that navigate throughout this crowd. Originally, I'm a William James scholar, and when you were talking about the personal, something that came back to me was like the way he dealt with like mystical experiences. And he the over like the barest bone of the argument was that we should not sort of excise any form of personal experience out of our philosophies and the way we deal with what is actually important in our lives and like theoretical lives. So the overall thing that like, and the reason why it came back to me, because a lot of this like personal perspective I was talking about, both as an object of my study and my own perspective on lo-fi, felt most of the time like a very mundane and secular form of sort of mystic disembodiment. And I did not want to excise that sort of experience from my writing of lo-fi and writing lo-fi.
Well, I mean, in my case, the lo-fi music that I have produced in my life, and in fact, among the albums and EPs that I have out, most of them I would call like a lo-fi ambient drone project. I think even the music itself, in that case, lends itself to a kind of meditation almost on the level of navel gazing, because it's almost like you're creating this kind of audio zoetrope where you get into this space and it creates this bubble of affect that allows you to process the world in a very different way. And this probably happens with all kinds of lo-fi music, you know, from punk, you know, even industrial or something like that. But what strikes me as interesting is, you know, the fact that you're coming from this fan perspective, a fan theory. It's almost a way of conceiving of a minor philosophy or a minor aesthetics in a certain way, which does not mean an inferior aesthetics by any mean. In fact, one of the figures that you take on in the book, or that you say who is motivating this, is Michel Foucault. And the idea of a genealogy, that you're conducting a genealogy of lo-fi music. And you also cite Jean-Luc Nancy, and the overlap between Nancy and Foucault in this case is the difficulty in identifying an origin to the beginning of one study. And maybe there's something distinct about why the genealogical method is, quote unquote, the right method to do a theory of lo-fi. I mean, what does a Hegelian theory of lo-fi look like? An absolute, like, this will be the final theory. But I'm curious about this choice. Well, why do you choose Foucault? Like, maybe you can explain a little bit what Foucault's genealogical method is and how does it apply to your study of lo-fi?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Foucault for me was a way to confront one of my biggest fear coming into the project, which was writing like the definitive history of lo-fi, writing, I don't know, the Our Band Could Be Your Life of lo-fi music. I didn't want to do that because there was like this underlying fear, first of all, that I was unable to do that. But secondly, and probably most importantly, the idea that like one unitary history of lo-fi music would sort of calcify what's important about lo-fi and make it like an object which unfolds linearly and goes from point A to point B and point C and develops this like internal reason and whatnot. And these were all things I wanted to avoid at any cost in my book, because I think that the biggest potential of lo-fi music, and that's something which came up talking not only to you but with a lot of other people, is the fact that when I say lo-fi music, a lot of people think a lot of different things. There's like no one lo-fi music. There's a vast array of genres that fall under the lo-fi category. So Foucault sort of came as an aid to my unwillingness to write this like overarching history of lo-fi music. Foucault's genealogical method, again, putting it very simply, it's a method according to which you do not go looking for the continuities in history, but you seek out the points of rupture where one paradigm gives way to another. So you do not look for a history that is linear, that is rational, even that it excludes like any sort of hiccup or very like disruptive event. And instead you go looking for a history that it's composed basically all of like breaking points and differences and moments of rupture, so to speak. So it is a non-conservative, non-linear way of making history, in a sense. Not making history, but making like a narrative of how, I don't know, power unfolded in this or that century. And of course, this perspective gave me the possibility to treat lo-fi not as sort of a linear unfolding, but as a broken set of different artists doing wildly different things, following wildly different agendas, but unified by this willingness to sabotage the whole studio industrial complex. So what sort of Foucault is not very present in the book. I mean, Foucault finishes off the book actually, but it is only present insofar as it gave me a theoretical justification of why I was not writing a Hegelian history of lo-fi. It was my way of saying this will not be everything there is to lo-fi, but it's a very partisan perspective, and it will highlight mostly the differences and not like how things hang together.
And you do mention also at the beginning of the book that there's a relative paucity of lo-fi theory, and that which exists out there mostly concerns like visual lo-fi, the degraded visual image. But despite that, I'm curious because, you know, when I think of Mark Fisher's concept of hauntology, I mean, the first thing I'm thinking of is actually the music and, you know, recycled retro, low fidelity cultural repetitions, you know, Mark Fisher's interest in ghost box records. And then, you know, folks like Boards of Canada, who we talked about, Quartet, Casino versus Japan, like these labels from the past, folktronica, nostalgiatronica, you know, all of these kinds of music that, you know, try to induce this dreamlike delirium we might associate with the hauntological. But with all that in mind, how do you see your theory of lo-fi music against this concept of hauntology? Are there points of departure? Are there points of intersection? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, my book is certainly a Mark Fisher heavy book. In many senses, it is a continuation of many threads that Mark left in his work. So there was definitely the question for me. I mean, in the beginning, I wanted to talk about hauntology quite explicitly throughout the book, but I was a little terrified of the idea that would sort of give a certain image of lo-fi, and it would sort of put lo-fi in a box of being this very nostalgic music obsessed with retro techniques of production, which I don't believe is the case. I was talking to a dear friend of mine who's also a musician, and at one point he was sort of talking about the ways in which lo-fi recordings are done, and he blocked me. He blocked the whole thing we were talking about by saying, well, most of the things I record that I consider lo-fi are recorded on my phone. And I think it is the case for a lot of very up-and-coming bedroom producers that they may not be recording literally on their phone, but there is definitely a very contemporary feel to the machinery they use. It's mostly occurring through computers and through cracked softwares and things like that. So I wanted to give an image of lo-fi which was able to do away with nostalgia, to be on the offensive most of the time, and take into the account the fact that things are changing and things have changed, and a lot of culture has moved forward from the sort of very ontologically inclined world we were living in the 2010s. And there's and I wanted to sort of sidestep the whole question. But I also believe that hauntology does play a big role in a lot of the lo-fi imagination. I was thinking about, because of course I was getting ready for the Boards of Canada onslaught, and I cannot imagine a better record for like a theory, for like an auditory theory of capitalist realism than Tomorrow's Harvest. It is one of the most desolate records I can think of. So there is definitely this sort of like, when I was writing the book, I wanted to sort of exclude or sidestep the question because I wanted to be on the offense all the time. But there is definitely a sort of sneaking suspicion in me that I missed out on a lot of good things that lo-fi has done to convey a certain malaise and the sort of like temporal sickness we are experiencing under capitalism. Case in point, again, another example I think is like the books that I was revisiting right now, the folktronica bands that are not actually lo-fi, but they are sort of like found, sort of have an interest in like sound from the past in a very like broad sense of the term. And yes, there's definitely a strong feeling that a lot of that music is giving away an interesting sort of sonic theory of our present condition. But I also believe that my book is very much anti-hauntological in a sense.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Tomorrow's Harvest, because I mean, when we think about hauntology and even the concept of capitalist realism, I don't think any title better captures, the promise of capitalist realism than Tomorrow's Harvest. And even probably the strongest track on that album, which is called Reach for the Dead, which leaves you to ask, who is reaching for whom? There's a way in which our reach towards the hauntological is a kind of reach for the dead, but yet something else is reaching for us as well. It's kind of a dual reach in some sense. But that this brings up another interesting point about the current state of lo-fi as it's understood, at least in terms of the simulacra or the simulacrum of lo-fi, whether it's through guitar pedals, virtual instruments, virtual effects, even in some of the pop songs. I mean, how many times since the 2010s has the Motown sound been recreated, for example, that sort of shimmery reverb, not to mention, I've ripped off Boards of Canada, who hasn't, sort of doing this thing. And now there's a whole industry, a whole capitalist industry behind producing this sound. And it's almost ridiculous that one would spend anywhere between $500 and $2,000 for a computer that's capable of producing probably the highest quality album possible out there today, but so many young people reaching back for that degraded sound. I mean, to me, it just seems like capitalist recuperation at work. But do you think that the advent or the proliferation of those technologies diminish the liberatory prospects that lo-fi holds for us in some sense? Like, where's the in-between there?
Yeah, there is definitely something to be said about a sort of fetishization of lo-fi in our current condition, because it is indeed true that a lot of music is unnecessarily lo-fi in a sense, or it's willingly lo-fi better, because it is very much more of an aesthetic choice than something born out of necessity. And it is indeed a paradox to have like a super expensive computer to record something that feels like it's been recorded on a potato or something like that. But I think there's the thing that it's important to keep in mind is that, as far as I'm concerned, lo-fi is still mostly a tactic and not a genre. So what I think it's interesting about this sort of repurposing of lo-fi in non-lo-fi conditions is this sort of unwillingness to look under the hood, in a sense. The thing that scares me the most about a software that reproduces a sort of degraded effect, a retro effect, is not so much the fact that it's fake, because I don't want to use the authenticity jargon. I think it would be kind of dumb. But it's a sort of fear that it will put people in the position of not looking at the machine in a creative way. So I'm not very much concerned about sort of the inauthenticity of the contemporary lo-fi sound. I'm way more afraid of the fact that a software could sort of cut out the whole hacker, the hacker ethos of putting one's hand into the machine itself. So looking how the software works or how the computer itself works, and repurposing it, sabotaging it even to make it work otherwise. You said before that we probably have the biggest possibilities in human history to actually produce the best sounds ever with the easiest and most available means ever. But what I think it's even more interesting is that we have the possibility of producing basically inconceivable sound for previous generations. And I wouldn't want to see those possibilities snuffed out of existence because we sort of take for granted the machines that we are using. One of the examples that it's not lo-fi at all, but which could be a very good exemplification of the sort of like sabotaging ethos is, as far as I'm concerned, Sophie.
Yeah.
Because a lot of that sort of music production was very much hands-on, on the machine, on the programming, and basically aimed at producing the strangest sound a pop song could fit. And that is a very good example of the sort of lo-fi ethos I tried to sort of sketch out in my book. And it's not lo-fi, but because I don't think it really matters the quality of the production. It's more the relationship you have with certain machines and certain ways of making songs and sounds.
Now, here comes the big question, the important question. In fact, when folks knew that I was going into this interview today, they said, you're certainly going to ask Enrico about lo-fi beats to study to or relax to, right? And this ubiquitous phenomenon of the lo-fi beat. One, on the one hand, we'll paint two pictures here. One, this sort of, kind of like loungy bedroom sound that helps you get through the night. It actually helps you, get through that paper that you're working on, study for that Calculus 2 exam or whatever. On the other side, we got this ontological flatness, this sterility. And one of the complaints that we hear about lo-fi beats or lo-fi beats to study to is, oh, do you know how easy it is to produce this stuff? Or, it's just the kind of same thing over and over again. I mean, it's arguable that lo-fi beats to study to, there's somebody who's going to be working at Lockheed Martin next year at this time who's using lo-fi beats to study to get through whatever exams or tests they need to get through to get the skills that they need. I'm curious, like, where you stand, like, where does your theory of lo-fi fit in with this ubiquitous phenomenon?
Yeah, this phenomenon has been haunting me since like the day I decided to write a book on lo-fi. There's one anecdote I want to put out there because I think it was one of the best things that happened in this like promotional cycle. I was hanging out at like this bar for a lecture, for like an event. And I was talking to a friend of a friend, and and the book comes out and like pops up as a topic, and he asked me, oh, what is it about? And I was like, yeah, it's about lo-fi music. And immediately he goes like, oh, cool, yeah, I love that. Plus it's such a new genre. And I look at him and I was like, sort of, I mean, in a sense. And I ask him, what is your favorite artist? And I'm not lying, he straight, like with the straightest face ever, he's like, Lo-Fi Girl. And I was like, okay, that's cool. But I think that in that sort of earnestness in saying that Lo-Fi Girl was his favorite artist, there's a very strong image of what lo-fi means right now, because a lot of people associate lo-fi music with this sort of production of very, like, basically identical beats over very smooth, loungy sounds and whatnot. And my sort of theory about it is quite simple. First off, it sucks, and that's my take on it.
First, folks.
Secondly, and more theoretically, I think it is quite dangerous because it is both mood music and productivity music.
Right. Yeah.
It is music basically meant to enhance your ability to function in the capitalist market. And that's the polar opposite of what I wanted to write about. The lo-fi music I was talking about was disruptive, psychedelic, this sort of like very combative ethos. And lo-fi beats to study and relax to is the absolute opposite. I couldn't think of something like further from what I wanted to write about. So yeah, that's I think is all I have to say.
Well, I have to agree with you. I think there's something about the lo-fi beats phenomenon that definitely enhances and upholds the delirium behind the productivist mindset. There's no doubt about it. But maybe I'm a little bit more of a right wing, on the right wing of lo-fi here, in the sense that, like, it's kind of, as Deleuze and Guattari would say, it's the little bit of subjectivity in my pocket. Like when I need to get down and focus on something for an hour, I won't lie to you, I have put it on the background. I confess. I don't know if there's a gulag for lo-fi beats, but I'll be. Yes. Excellent. Well, I have a couple more questions, but maybe I'll just ask like one more sort of bigger question for the end of the interview. And that has to do with acid communism. And I mean, you talk about several figures in your book. You talk about Brian Wilson, R. Stevie Moore, but I'd like to focus on the bit that you write about Daniel Johnston and his acid communism. And I thought it was interesting because there's a way in which, you say that he's like this acid communist avant la lettre, here's my challenge is like, given that Johnston had this sort of like fairly like Manichaean Christian worldview, he viewed the world in terms of good and evil. And you suggest that he had this sort of political theology that not only infused his life, but his music as well. How is that the case? And what is the intersection here, or the connection to Mark Fisher's acid communism? And maybe you'll have to give us a short biography of Daniel Johnston's life in order to do that.
Sure. Yeah, let's start with the biography first, because I think that Daniel Johnston is quite interesting, mostly because he comes from a very religious background. He was raised in a very Christian household. He himself, I think that he called it either integralist or something to that effect. And despite the fact that, of course, I was born and raised Catholic in fairly strict house. So so my first like instinctive move was to distance myself from Christianity and that sort of world. Daniel Johnston, on the contrary, he took it up as one of the main themes of his music. His songs are literally like full of God and angels and whatnot. There's one song that is basically the recreation of the book of Genesis in like a 3-minute track. And therefore, I found myself in the position of asking myself, what's revolutionary about this? Because I was sure that Daniel Johnston was a revolutionary figure. And so the way I went about it was to construct for Daniel Johnston, because Daniel Johnston was not sort of a systematic political theological thinker, but I could constructed for him this sort of political theology that rests upon love and hope and evil as the 3 main pillars. Evil is this world, the boredom of this world, the way it sort of sucks out your creative energy and all that. And love and hope are the things that move you forward. Love is this sort of like vision of a world beyond this, and hope is the certainty that this world can actually exist at some point. What I think and the reason why I decided to take this political theology and claim that it was a form of acid communism stems from the fact that Mark Fisher himself, quoting Marcuse, was very much keen on the idea that acid communism did not have to be an intentional project all the time. It didn't have to be this sort of like very bureaucratic party-like mentality where everyone has to fall in line with the ideology or else you're not an actual acid communist. He claimed that a lot of acid communism stemmed from the raw intensity of certain songs or cultural artifacts that were able to embody this like voice from the outside, as he calls it. And I believe that there is no one more suitable for this sort of embodiment of an outsider perspective than Daniel Johnston himself. Because Daniel Johnston was sort of moved by this very extreme outsider need to put out in the world this very outsider vision of the world itself. It was basically outsider all the way through. There's nothing complacent about Daniel Johnston. Daniel Johnston was very much convinced that this sort of like vision of God and love that he had for himself was like this vision of a world beyond. And therefore, I think that the sort of the comparison, albeit it's a bit of a trip in and of itself, holds water, because Daniel Johnston was the sort of singer-songwriter for this mass of people who's unable and most of the time unwilling to comply with the way life under capitalism normally works. So yeah, I think that the basic tenet is the sort of is both the idea that you don't have to be an acid communist ideologically to be one, and also the fact that Daniel Johnston is probably the most suitable for this role, especially because he was obsessed with this psychedelic culture from the 60s that Mark Fisher was interested in when he wrote his fragment. So there's so much characteristic that sort of fit the mold that made me want to go ahead and try the heresy of saying this person is an acid communist.
Oh, no. Excellent. I think that's an excellent application. In fact, once I had read the section on Daniel Johnston, I went to the YouTube videos. As you probably know, there's a documentary that was done on him back from 2015, which is excellent. But I landed upon a video of him on an LSD trip. Yeah. And I think it's interesting to hear his ramblings during the LSD trip, because where he does talk about escape, he also mentions the evils of the corporations that are haunting him, targeting him, and so forth, which is I mean, it's tragic, especially against, his unrequited love, Lori, the girl that never was his girlfriend. But I think he did call her his girlfriend regardless. But anyway, I don't want to give away the whole book, Enrico. This is an excellent book. You have many more figures in the book that are definitely worthy of talking about. The book is The Great Psychic Outdoors, Lo-Fi Music and Escaping Capitalism, out on Repeater Books. And we will hopefully have Enrico back at some point to talk about something else, if possible.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you next time. We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zero Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zero has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.